Obviously, you think ships and vessels in San Francisco. Well, it's not San Francisco. It's about 10,000 miles away off in that great fifth continent, Australia. And I'm not going to take this storm away from him, but when I saw some of the slides, I started remembering all my World War II history. So it gives me great privilege to invite him. I'll be in and out during the program, but do enjoy it, and I'm sure you'll take questions at the end, correct?
Yep, and if you would hold them to the end, I'd really appreciate it.
Okay, it's all yours, and I'll go ahead and give you the controls and turn the lights down.
Forward, reverse. Okay. In the early days of World War II, things were very black for the United States and its allies in the South Pacific. Every battle was lost. On sea and in land, the Japanese were predominant everywhere. Now, the only cheering thing was there were some stories of real courage and bravery on the part of some of our troops. Wake Island, Bataan, Corregidor, they made us think that, well, maybe in the long haul we might prevail. But there's one particular heroic incident involving two ships, one Australian, one American, that didn't become known until after World War II for reasons that I'll explain as we go along. This particular coin, a $5 commemorative coin, was struck in Australia by the Royal Australian Mint to commemorate this heroic battle of these two ships, the Houston and the Perth, both lost at sea in terrible circumstances. Now, let's start early in the war with what happened at the beginning.
Could you tilt your mic a little bit more closer to you?
Yeah, okay, I've got a soft voice. This is Admiral Yamamoto, who led the Japanese invasion force at Pearl Harbor. It was a complete surprise. The United States was ill-prepared. Planes were destroyed on the ground. Ships were destroyed. It was absolutely a disaster. Now, this is an actual photo of a Japanese torpedo bomber taking off for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, you have to remember that when they went in, they had a lot of information on exactly where everything was. They knew where all of our battleships were. They knew them by name. They were all lined up in a row, all 10 of them, and they were open to easy attack. They actually had spies on the islands who gave them the locations of most of the major ships. Now, the one thing they couldn't give them, which the Japanese were sick about later, was the location of the aircraft carriers, our aircraft carriers, which were out to sea at the time of the attack, which was fortunate because otherwise the war might have lasted a couple years longer. Now, this is the USS West Virginia, sinking at anchor, burning, exploding. One of the battleships lined up there, torpedoed, hit by bombs. Now, and another point to make on torpedoes is the Japanese had very effective torpedoes. When they hit, they exploded. And when they were aimed at a ship, they went at it. They didn't go under it, like American torpedoes did till later in the war. Nobody knew in the public about what had happened in terms of American torpedoes until the war was over. But the people flying the planes and in the submarines knew very well. Oh, sorry, going the wrong way here. Now, this is the most famous of all the battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor, the USS Arizona. This is a shot taken not long after she was hit. She's exploding and going down. Her ammunition stores exploded. 1,100 men went down with the ship, and they were entombed in the ship. This is the ruins later of the Arizona later on. And later in the war, they began to think about what kind of memorial they might make of it. And after the war, they built a beautiful memorial over the ruins of the Arizona. Hundreds of thousands of people visited it every year. And one of the very poignant things is that as you're standing there looking out in the water, every few minutes, a few drops of oil still come up from all those years past. So that's a continual reminder of what happened to us at Pearl Harbor. Now, this is one of the ships in question. It's the USS Houston in Darwin Harbor, just a couple of months before the action in which she participated. She carried about 1,100 men and a very fit and capable warship. Now, what happened at this stage and how the Houston and the Perth got involved was that the Japanese fleet and the American Allied fleet, which was considered a very effective fleet at the time, commanded by Admiral Dorman, a Dutch captain. It contained Dutch ships, American ships, Australian ships, and British ships. And they met them in pitched battle. The only battle of the war that was entirely a surface battle, no aircraft involved. And the Allied fleet was just decimated. It completely destroyed. Again, the Japanese had more ships. They had better trained seamen and captains. They did a better job. This is the cruiser Exeter, a British cruiser sinking in the Battle of Java Sea, as it was called. Now, the Houston and the Perth were the only survivors of that battle. And they were trying to get to Australia. You know, the battle for them was over. They headed out through the Sunda Straits, and what they ran into was a major Japanese invasion fleet headed for Java. They fought valiantly for about 4 to 5 hours, taking torpedoes, taking shell fire, until they were burning and sinking, both of them. They both went down. At the end, they had no ammunition left, and they were firing their 50 caliber machine guns. So they went down. Now, some of the men on board, and I'll mention again the torpedoes. The Japanese long lance torpedoes were very, very effective. They were superior to ours. It wasn't until after Midway that they started to improve the situation in terms of our torpedo equipment. This gentleman is a sailor named Daniel Rafalovich. He was a sailor from the Houston. This was taken before the action, months before. And so he had a very interesting experience, and I'll get into that in a little while. The men on board the Houston, about 1,000, and the same on the Perth, went down with the ship, most of them over 700, but 368 of the Houston sailors and 328 of the Perth seamen were taken up by the Japanese from the water. Now, if they knew what was going to happen to them, they probably would have opted to go down with the ship, because things were going to get a great deal worse for them. The Japanese had decided, knowing that the Americans were going to improve their capabilities at sea and in the air, to build a 242-mile railway from Siam to Burma, so they could move troops and supplies by land and not have to worry about any problems at sea. So what they decided to do was to use Allied prisoners. They took about 61,000 Allied prisoners, Americans, not as many Americans, Dutch, Australians, British, and put them to work as slave laborers on this railroad. Now, this was completely contrary to the Geneva Convention, which they had signed. But they said, well, we didn't ratify it. We signed it, but we didn't ratify it. So they paid no attention to the provisions of the Geneva Convention throughout the war. as a lot of you are well aware in terms of what you've read after the war. It was a horrible experience. Now, this is one of the bridges that they built along that railroad. You're familiar with the movie The Bridge Over the River Kwai. Well, there were lots of bridges, dozens of them built, and the movie The Bridge Over the River Kwai is a wonderful soap opera compared to what these people really went through. It was a horrible, terrible experience. They were treated as animals. There was very little food, very little water. Even the doctors from the various prison units, they weren't all Perth and Houston people, there were thousands of people, were not allowed to work as doctors, except after they completed their daily work, on the railroad. Now, they built camps along the way so they could have people working on one section of the railroad while others were working on another section, and they would all join together. In one of these camps, out of 1,600 men, 1,200 of them died. It wasn't only lack of food and medical equipment and treatment and supplies, but it's also the presence of fevers of various sort and diseases. So they died at a terrific rate. Over 1/3 of all the men working on those railroads, on that railroad, died. Now, they also put to work 190,000 Asians, men, women, and children on it. The higher rate of loss for them, out of 190,000, close to 100,000 died. It was a very brutal, horrible experience. Now, if someone didn't want to work and quit work, he'd be bayoneted. Simple as that. If you argued with one of the guards, the sadistic guards, he'd use a baseball bat on you and break bones. They actually were absolutely sadistic. And of course, that gets back to that theory of theirs in terms of the military, that anyone who's captured in combat is less than an animal, deserves no treatment at all. The real soldiers on our side, they figured, had already died. Now, this shows the condition some of these people were in. This picture and the one that follows it were actually taken by one of the prisoners who had a small camera that somehow had slipped through all the searches they had. And he took these pictures near the end of the railroad effort to show what his fellow prisoners, the condition they were in. And I doubt very much if these men survived. They appear to be in the last stages of starvation. He wanted to take these pictures, and he took them. And he took these two. If you look at the man on the left, his belly's extended from malnutrition. So it was a horrible experience, and it didn't end, the railroad part of it, until October of 1943, when they finished the railroad. Now, those prisoners from the Perth and the Houston and others who thought that, well, okay, something better has to happen, couldn't have been more wrong, because the ones that were still alive, the Japanese had other work for them to do. They were going to send them to Japan to work as slave laborers, and they did. Now, unfortunately for the prisoners, by the time they were sending these people in transports which were actually called hell ships, they would throw them down into the bowels of the ship with little food, little water, with the supplies down there, and half of them would die on the way over. Some died of suffocation. So, but that wasn't the only problem they had. At this stage, our submarines, who knew how to use good torpedoes by this stage, were starting to take a terrific toll on Japanese shipping, and so were our planes. And many of the prisoners from these camps died as a result of American fire, from torpedoes from submarines and from bombs by aircraft. No one knew who was on board these ships. They sank them. They were Japanese ships. And so that was the next stage. The ones who survived did go on to Japan, and when they got there, they had two of the worst winters they ever had, and they sent them to work in the coal mines in terrible conditions. The conditions were so bad that some of the prisoners actually put their feet in crushing machines so they wouldn't have to go down below again. Do you see the pattern from one end to the other, the barbaric treatment? Now, this is one of the cases where some of these people were prisoners. A ship called the Ryukyu Maru was sunk in, off Hainan, and the two submarines, American submarines that sank the ship, surfaced, and to their amazement, they found American prisoners floating and swimming in the water. And one submarine saved 72 of them, and the other saved 52. Now that's out of 2,000 men. I think the Japanese brought a few of them up out of the water. The rest they just left to the sharks. So the situation couldn't have been more horrible. These men on these ships, the Houston and the Perth, went from one tragedy to another through their whole military career. And now, late in the war, the Japanese, as they were losing the war, became more and more aggressive and cruel towards prisoners. They were especially angry and cruel to American airmen. Some of Jimmy Doolittle's original pilots were beheaded towards the end of the war. Several B-29 pilots captured, when they bombed Singapore, were marched through the streets and then beheaded. 3 flyers who were captured when they bombed Hainan were tortured and then buried alive. So the treatment that was bad early on was worse as the war started to come to an end, and particularly, as I say, towards the airmen. And this is one of them being beheaded before some happy witnesses. Now, after the war, they were able to identify a lot of the prison guards. And when they did, the trials were short. This is one of them being hung. You know, the ones that they captured were checked against the memories of some of the prisoners. And when they were identified, it wasn't a long trial with the ACLU defending them. It was short and quick. Now, to the Australian government, this thing was even more important than it was to us. A loss of a ship with 1,000 men to what was a tinier island in terms of population then than it is now was a major event. So they wanted to find the Perth, and a diver, Australian diver named David Burchell, hunted it down for years, and he finally found it. This is the Salvage ship that is over the site. They're dropping a wreath to commemorate it. Now, they brought up a lot of artifacts, and what they did with them, they gave one artifact to the commander of the new Perth, and they gave an artifact to the wife of the former commander of the Perth who went down with the ship, and they gave some of them to the survivors. Interestingly enough, these survivors, a lot of them have kept very close to the situation, and they're compatriots. A fellow named Otto Schwartz from New Jersey wrote a newsletter to the Houston survivors for years and years, bringing them up to date on what's going on with their compatriots. And they had reunions once a year. This is the Houston survivors. And 50 years after the event, 1992, they had a big reunion in Australia of the Houston and Perth survivors, which got a great deal of attention. This is a really fascinating and dramatic story. No one knew about it at the time. No one knew what had happened to these men. No one knew what had happened to the two ships. And it wasn't until years later that they got the recognition they deserved. And one of the recognitions was this beautiful commemorative coin produced by the Australian Mint. It was a fitting memorial to brave men and heroic ships. I'll take any questions that you want. You can bring it up now. I don't know. I don't know. If there were, they were picked up somehow, but I don't know. All I know is that it was a devastating defeat. It was wiped out, except the two cruisers which escaped and headed for Australia. I don't know.
Were these light cruisers or heavy cruisers?
These were light cruisers. Yeah.
Houston was heavy cruiser.
Yeah, Houston had 3 guns. Yeah, there was a heavy cruiser, and you're right, the Perth was a light cruiser. Yeah.
Houston had 9 8-inch guns.
Yeah.
Heavy cruiser.
And they identified the Perth when they died because the Houston had 3 forward guns, and the Perth had 2. When they found the Perth, the wreck, and they found it had 2 guns. In the location where they knew they'd gone down, they said, we got the Perth, and they did. Now, let me mention something on the Houston. They actually went after the Houston, too, and found the wreck of the Houston. They brought up the bell, which you can find on display, and I think it was in a park at one time. I don't know where it is now, but it's on display in the city of Houston. So that was the major find in terms of salvage of the Houston, and they brought the ship's bell up. That's why they show the ship's bell on here. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been a real pleasure for me. I bought this coin a few years ago.